everybody, welcome. This is Laurel McCombs with the Osborne Group. I'm so excited for another one of our Osborne Group chats. Today we are going to be talking about something that I've been wanting to talk about for a really long time because I am, as many of you know, a fund development dork. As much as I love the relationship building and strategizing part of the work we do, I equally, and maybe a little bit more, love the systems and processes and metrics side of what we do. And so I'm super excited to be joined today by two professionals who do this for a living, who get to do this for a living every single day, working on the database development, systems and operations side of this work that we do. I'm joined today by Rabia Syed, who is the Director of Systems and Administration for the Center for Popular Democracy. And I'm also joined by Sungbin Kim, who is the Director of Database and Development Operations for Project Home. Welcome, Rabia and Sung. Thank you so much for being here. I'd love to just start by having a little bit, because I think, not everybody has director level positions in their organizations focus on systems, operations, database management. So I'd love to just ask first each of you to share a little bit about what your jobs entail and what you do on a day-to-day basis. Rabia, why don't you start?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me today, Laurel. So I'm the Director of Systems and Administration at the Center for Popular Democracy, which is a national political organizing network headquartered in New York, but we also have an office in DC, and we have affiliated organizations all over the country. I work with a team that manages CPD's technology and administrative operations, so we don't specifically work with CRM, although we do have staff who work with our CRM systems. And at our organization, we've actually created a cross-team, a cross-department team that has folks from tech and ops, which is my team, our public affairs team, which includes media relations and digital, our political team, because electoral victories are very important to us, in our organizing teams.
Great. Sung, how about you?
Yeah, hi everyone. I am Sungbin Kim, and I operate out of Philadelphia. So Project Home serves just the Philadelphia community, but that's not to say that we don't do work that could be recognized globally, because it is in overcoming homelessness. And so we have a unique situation where HOME actually stands for housing, opportunities for employment, education, and medical care. So because it reaches all across those databases, we're in a unique situation where, my role is under the development department, and the development department houses communications as well. So it's a lot of the big stuff happening in one department. And you kind of like jumped right into the topic that I thought I would get into, which is just how much we do and how much it just cross-references all the other departments. And so just being able to access all the data is like such a critical thing. And sometimes it's not possible. So I'm going to leave it at that for further discussion. But
yeah, it's so interesting. I was actually just I was doing a board retreat a couple of weeks ago with a hospital foundation, and they had one of their kind of director of technology and innovation came on and talked about some of the really exciting things that their hospital was working on. And he actually talked about the fact that hospital innovation and technology is in some ways really behind the curve in terms of other technology out in the world. And it is always interesting to me, because I know I've known both of you for a really long time, and the three of us have worked on technology related projects going as far back as like 10 years now. And you think about how much technology has changed, and the nonprofit sector kind of in general tends to lag right behind some other areas. But I feel like we're finally catching up a little bit with other aspects. I don't know, what are your perspectives on kind of where we are, especially this cross-functional thing I think that both of you mentioned is really interesting to me. Like, where do you think we are as an industry in terms of being where we need to be technologically?
Rabia?
Thank you, Sung. That's an interesting question, Laurel. I think One thing that, so the Center for Popular Democracy is a movement building organization. And I think one thing that's perhaps not unique to movement building organizations, but something we definitely experience is that a lot of the technology is not built by movement folks. It is sometimes built by people who come from the private sector and think they understand the needs of nonprofits, or some of the tools are built by movement folks, but those folks don't have the resources that Salesforce has, or they don't have investors who are willing to allow them to build a tool that can reach people at scale. So I think it really depends. At the Center for Popular Democracy, we actually rely on multiple tools to talk to our constituents and communicate with those folks and activate them. And I think one thing that a lot of nonprofits would benefit from is thinking about CRM not as just one software or one tool that you adopt, but rather an ecosystem of tools. And I think in the nonprofit space, there are tools that are innovative and there are tools that, have been around since 1990 and are perhaps not as innovative. But one challenge I think to the nonprofit sector is that we haven't really figured out, we figured out ways, expensive ways to integrate tools to create a holistic ecosystem that supports our operations, our program work, and allows us to raise more money and activate more people in the world. But it's usually expensive, and it usually involves a lot of time and energy from those organizations trying to build those systems.
Such a great point.
Yeah. Awesome, Rabia. I'm glad you went first because now I have to follow that. I'm not going to follow that. I'm just going to change the topic entirely. But I think as a timeline, we're definitely early stages. On the points that Rabia made, you have to have a Rabia to even kind of understand the scope of how technologies work together, how to consolidate that into the budget, how to make that work for your organization, whether you're starting up or in the middle of it, right? So transitioning from one database that everyone's used to, that they love the system, and then trying to step into the future and say, hey, we need at the bare minimum these new technologies. So how do we integrate your legacy data into the new world? So it's a lot of that. And it's the people that you have put into place. So it's having someone that has that understanding of, hey, we know where you were, we know what you were doing a great job, but here's some new things to think about and how you have to keep up. Otherwise, you're going to get left behind.
It really does feel like that integration piece and that cross-functionality is kind of the new frontier. And I know, which is weird to say now, because 10 years ago, we were working on a project where we were trying to integrate development of program technology, right? And so it's weird 10 years later to say, this is the new frontier, but it does feel like across the sector that most organizations, hopefully, although I do talk to people every single day who don't have just the basic CRM database in place, but many organizations now have kind of a good programmatic database. Maybe they have a good CRM database. Maybe they've got a couple of other tools, but it is kind of that integration that is kind of the next step. But I like that, Sung, how you talked about a timeline, because I think that's a helpful way for people, and maybe people who are watching us today, to think about, how do you kind of assess hey, here's where I am today. Here's maybe 3 to 5 years down the road where we'd like to be. And then how do we kind of consciously, strategically get to that point?
Yeah, I think the companies out there, again, they're not trying to confuse us, but it's a lot. It's, they're also providing what we're asking for. So it's you have experts asking for things that beginners don't need, and vice versa. So it's how do you consolidate the best tool when you as an organization know that you're here now and need certain things, and then in 5 years may evolve and you may not evolve. I don't know. And it all depends on how successful your organization runs, and of course we don't have to say how unpredictable that is in this market, right?
After the last year that we've had.
Yeah.
So that gets me kind of to my next question, which is the question I get asked all the time when I talk about technology. And I don't just want to focus on CRMs today, but it's kind of we are in development, and this is the question that gets asked all the time is, so Laurel, what are your recommendations around which CRM I should choose? And I typically, we kind of were chatting before we jumped on the recording to say, well, there's not really like one that is the best, but I think you kind of started to talk about this. I guess I'd be curious from both of you, like if someone is ready to take that step, like I'm ready to maybe invest in a new CRM, maybe I've never had one before, or maybe I have one that's just awful. I have a few clients who are just like, whatever I have right now is just awful and we need to invest in something new. What are some of the questions that people should be asking themselves? What are some of the decision points that people should be thinking about?
I think a good place to start is doing a little bit of soul searching on the leadership level. And
that, Rabia.
these are never just technology projects. This is about organizational change, thinking about where you want to be 1 year, 3 year, 5 years and beyond. And this also requires people in an organization to move in the same direction together, which can be a challenge, when most of us have competing priorities every day. And, the world throws a lot at our organizations. I think like good questions to ask yourself and for leadership to ask themselves include like, who are our constituents? How do we engage with those people? And how can technology support our program work? An example of how we address these questions at my organization is in addition to donors and activists, we are a federated network and we do sub-grant to our affiliated orgs. So we required a tool that had a grants management functionality, a pretty good one that still allowed flexibility for our network because no two organizations function the same. And we also had a requirement that data, because these are grants, that data was able to sync to our financial tools in a way that was painless. Another consideration that we had was our electoral work. Some of our program work depends on voter outreach and targeting. So we also needed a system that integrated with all of the various state voter files. A lot of orgs have many priorities from its CRM, but I've seen the most success in organizations where the project is anchored by a team, and that team is staffed by an executive stakeholder who can help facilitate decision-making at the leadership level. And ideally on this team, people have very clearly defined roles, which we know can change over time at a lot of organizations, but at least having that conversation and having roles defined is a good starting place. And I think it's also important, and Sung touched on this earlier, that folks have like a commonly understood work plan that includes benchmarks and timelines that people agree on.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think both Rabia and I are lucky to have progressed in this field to the titles that we have. And just to say that, we both, I think, I'm assuming on your part, Rabia, but I think we're both working for organizations that are very focused and have that as part of their plan. But I can always see more improvement for all of us in general. So being regarded as, and this is a term I heard recently, which is just a data scientist, and just to have that kind of mentality about it, like data analytics. So on a for-profit, you have folks that are data analysts, and so a nonprofit should, again, to keep up, have that kind of sensibility too. And I'm not saying that I'm there, but I certainly wouldn't mind being part of a team that understands that, data is more than just being under an existing department. It could stand on its own. And so you have those folks feeding into an executive level data team, then that would be something that would be the right attitude to have when you're a large organization. And I think I want to back up and say that if you're an organization looking for databases, I think they're all, you can't go wrong because you've done the research, you know what you're capable of, you know your budget, first of all, right? You're not gonna spend the most money for something you're not ready for. So if you start small, think about where you may transition, what you might need next year. You're not using this year, but does this tool allow me to be flexible in transferring all the data that I have in a way that I'll need it later in the future? So all the things that Rabia said about connections, it exists. So like there's always connectors, there's always apps, there's always things that, you know, will help you get what you need externally to get you through that. So, you know, having the people in your department, in your organization, in your back pocket is the best way to go. I feel like that's the investment you have to have, because you have to follow through. If you don't follow through, you're now paying for a tool that no one believes in. You're not going to have any future in it. So it's bad news.
Yeah, it's so true. I do see a lot of people put huge amounts of investment into just buying the tool itself, but then don't think about who's going to use it, right? So such a great point. I feel like this also, Rabia, I'll just piggyback on what Sung just said about what you said that really struck me was this idea that, you know, I've been in this business now for more than 20 years, embarrassingly, all my little gray hairs, although Sung's gray hairs are way more pronounced than mine, even though I'm older. But when I started in this business, I can remember my first CRM, and it was a nightmare. Like you could hardly get anything into it, much less get anything out of it. And and there weren't options, right? Like there just was nothing. And now there's so many options. And I think there's still a lot of people, maybe my age or older, who still feel like you just have to like take what you get and then like make it work. And I think we're so far beyond that now. I mean, I think that systems are so upgradable and appable, and like there's, like to Sung's point, you can add apps and you can add connectors and you can make things talk to things, and we no longer live in this world where you're like handed this one little system and you have to like just struggle and figure out how to make it work, right? Like you can actually. And the other thing that so few of my clients realize is that you can actually go back to the vendor and ask them to do things for you, right? Like you can ask them to create customized reports, and you can ask them to go back and code some things for you differently. And like, there's so many more options. So I guess that's one of the other things that I find myself telling people a lot is the questions that you should be asking, in addition to what do you need it to do, and a lot of the things that both of you covered, is just questions to the vendor about their support to you, right? Like what's the training that you make available? What's the support? And I feel like where people, and I don't know, I'm curious how you feel about this. Like, I feel like where a lot of buyer's remorse comes into play is when people don't understand what the customer support service costs are on the back end of buying a new system. Do you see that?
I think it's more about, like you just said it already, but it's using it. So it's also using the customer service, knowing when to ask them and having those questions ready. Mm-hmm. So what are you able to help me for nothing, because we paid up front for it? And then, if I need something a little more customized for my needs, what does that cost? And then being able to budget that in the beginning, having an understanding that, you're going to incur some expenses when you're starting off with a tool, as opposed to when you're, used to one. That's something to consider too for any new folks out there trying to, start it up.
Such a great point about budget. I think, a lot of people are really good about budgeting front end expenses, like just the initial purchase and conversion costs, but aren't necessarily good at budgeting the upkeep.
One thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is everyone is on their best behavior during the sales process. And I think that it's really important if you don't have, sorry, this is real life and my grocery order is here. I'm going to say this real quick and then just let them in. Yeah. But I think if you don't have the organizational muscle around CRM and CRM selection, and you don't have people who have gone through this process before, I feel like it's a good idea to consult with others, either like allied organizations or consultants, to help you navigate the process with various vendors. Because you really, it's like dating, you don't know until you're in it.
Absolutely. Go get
I
your
wouldn't know anything about that though. I haven't dated. So actually she touched on something, and I'll kind of like take the time to paint my history. I started, with United Way, and then I worked both at a very national level organization and then a very local organization, and I did some consulting in between. So not to, say float my own boat or anything, but it gives me that good rounded experience of like knowing how to approach it from a national perspective versus a local. And I learned so much just in the few moments I was in consulting, because that way you get to kind of see everyone else's systems and see what they're struggling against. And so it's such an eye-opening experience to be able to see that, because it's always tends to be like the same thing. In my brief experience, of course, Laurel, you know more, but it's just folks looking for answers, and that's why I just, I wish I say we're in the beginning of that timeline, because I wish other people were looking at nonprofits and helping us, like the larger companies, trying to consolidate everything, not make it so difficult for folks like us to figure that all out. Yes, we have all the tools in place, but we have to be the ones that, through genius level of organization, figure out what matches our budget, what matches our workload, what matches all the departments and what their needs are. It's like, maybe if we can just consolidate one tool and have that just work with everything, that would be the dream. I always kind of thought about Google, but I don't know, they just haven't stepped up. They've had other priorities.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to some extent, Salesforce, because they have kind of added this nonprofit arm, and they do make, some of it available to certain nonprofits at reduced rates and things. But I agree. It feels like there's some collaboration that could be happening. I want to go back to a point that you made, Sung, a minute ago, about kind of thinking about roles beyond kind of like, I'm a database administrator, but more this idea of being a data scientist, right? I thought that was a really insightful comment, because I think this is somewhat especially for smaller to mid-sized organizations, I feel like this is the crux of the challenge, right? Is that for so long, CRMs were merely seen as like a database of where we like essentially like a digital Rolodex, right? Like it was just where we kept like the names and addresses and gift information, right, for donors. And what I see now is, I'll get on calls and I'll have a call about stewardship, and I'll be wanting to talk about donor retention and stewardship. And I'll say, how many of you know what your donor retention rate is? And so few people know, and so few people even know how, and most, in any given room, probably 75% of the people there have a decent CRM in place, but none of them know how to pull their donor retention rate, right? And so I do think this is something for people to really think about, which is, do you even think about your technology beyond just being the place where you keep information, and more where you keep data, right? Like,
Yeah.
a big difference.
Just while I have it in my head, that's the first thing that you kind of touched on when we started this call, which is that whole data across departments, right? So like, understood, we can't touch medical data. That's not something that we're going to ever be able to integrate. But when we have a CRM, or you're a large organization that approaches that need, you just want to try not to have double work, right? So if you have people in other departments talking to the same folks, you want to make sure they're educated, that they know that they're donors, that they're volunteers, that they're involved in other ways with your organization. And where is all that tracked? Is it the donor database? Is it their database, or whatever other source it is? And so if you don't consolidate that, you're only going to look foolish at the end of the day to your people. And so, and if you don't have someone that, in my role, it's usually one person, they're working by themselves, and they're only interested in clicking a button. Like, they're not really behind the whole reasoning for it. That's why a fundraiser is there. And so you have to get outside of that. You either have to have someone that is pulling those reports and thinking through on behalf of a fundraiser, because that's maybe their background and they have that, in touch with them. or vice versa. Like it just has to be, everyone has to be invested in it. They have to be invested in the report and why certain reports need to be pulled and what analysis needs to be done and so on. So
yeah, and it's always interesting to me. It's too, I mean, again, something we've been talking about for many years, this idea that a lot of those silos between whether or not somebody is a donor or a volunteer or a service recipient or a advocate or a whatever, so many of those silos are things that we create, right? They're not things that our constituents create. Like they're not sitting there saying like, oh, today I'm going to put my donor hat on and I'm going to engage with Center for Popular Democracy as a donor, and tomorrow I'm going to do some advocacy work. Like, no, they're just saying, I want to help Center for Popular Democracy, right? And so I think that really gets, and so much of what, I don't know if you guys have been following the work of community-centric fundraising and kind of their whole, the idea of kind of breaking down some of these silos between volunteers and donors, and how are we all just kind of supporting our missions and our visions, right? And I think that's, again, where breaking these silos down from a technology perspective becomes so important too. So before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about just hiring for people like you, people who do the kind of work that you do. This is another question that I get from a lot of clients, which is, again, I think many of my clients are maybe smaller or mid-sized organizations who are, hiring positions that are like database administrator, right? Or they are larger organizations like the organizations you work for that have maybe more robust data systems and have maybe a director level or even VP level kind of data role. So I would be curious for some of those smaller to mid-sized organizations that maybe have one person who's going to be doing this work. What are some things that maybe you would recommend that people look for when they're hiring somebody, knowing that a lot of times these are more entry-level positions? You've both been in these positions, right? You kind of both started your career in these positions. So what are you maybe looking for in hiring for that? And then maybe what are some of the things that people should think about as they're looking to expand those roles beyond entry level?
I think a lot of people's inclination is to hire the techie who can do all of the things in the database. And in my experience, oftentimes the technical work at a nonprofit can be done by contractors or consultants at a rate that is far cheaper than hiring a person full-time to do that kind of work. And obviously there are exceptions, but a smaller mid-sized organization probably doesn't have enough development needs for, and when I say development, I mean like software development or technical database work for a full-time resource there. I think one very important function of the CRM is creating bridges between departments and areas of work. And I think the ideal person working hands-on in a CRM system is a problem solver and able to facilitate conversations and move people towards making decisions between different departments in order for the technology to support various business processes that exist in our organizations.
That's great. It's really helpful.
Yeah, and if we're talking directly to the CEO, please, look into data scientists. So like find out what that means and see if that's the right way to think about your needs from that database administrator, as you may certainly have them already. So that person's going to do more than just be able to, analyze your current situation, but they're going to then recommend what your organization is going to need in, as you evolve. So it's, for hiring, just make sure to find someone that Rabia said is thinking at a higher level between cross departments, and just thinking like a fundraiser when they need to, thinking like a volunteer, thinking like the donor, and able to do that. So, and then hopefully opening up that department to have someone more in that day-to-day data and then to still retain someone that's going to do that analysis for your organization. And it could be a consultant, as Rabia mentioned. So all that to say, it's the budget as well to keep that in mind and make sure that person has enough time to focus on it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's such great advice. And I don't think that it's beyond the realm of possibility that you could still hire an entry level. So, you know, somebody right out of college or somebody with just a few years of experience, but who thinks of themselves as someone who's interested in data science versus somebody who just wants to enter data, right? Like this isn't a data entry position. This is a data, I'm going to use data science all the time now. Like this is a data science position. And I think if you can find ways in the interview process to ask some questions around what people are interested in and get to some of that future interest. You know, it's the same, no different than when I talk to a lot of people about hiring entry-level fundraising positions, right? Like it's fine to hire somebody to be a development coordinator who is really essentially probably just going to handle like coordinating with your vendor on direct mail and like, you know, plan some events, right? But they need to be doing all of those things with the perspective of like, I want to be a fundraiser, right? Like I want to understand development. And so I think it's no different when we think about the kind of operations and systems side of this as well. So we're going to wrap up, but before we do, I just want to ask both of you if there's any final thoughts or words of wisdom that you would want to share with any of our viewers today.
As a person who's been doing this for many, many years, it might be exciting to think about what you want your CRM to be doing for you in 5 to 10 years. I don't think that's a good idea. I feel like it's a better idea to think about the short and midterm and set realistic benchmarks in the short and midterm. And I think that's also the easiest way to move groups of people together to accomplish all of your CRM goals.
Great.
Yeah, I don't really have a final thought. I think we touched on so many that I ran out. But everything we mentioned, I think, is so important. So it's just take a look back and review what we were saying, and hopefully pick the thing that means the most to you, and just kind of like have that, you know, good start with your organization. You know, believing in the system, believing in the person that is going to own the system, and that you trust, because that's ultimately, you know, they're the holder of all your data. And so you don't want to upset IT, for example, if you need your computer working. So it should be the same attitude. If you want to get the most out of that position, then certainly, you know, think about that and put it in high regard.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank Rabia and Seng so much for joining me today and providing all of your expertise and really good thoughts on a topic that I think does not get talked about enough. If any of you out there have more questions for me, or if you wanted me to pass some questions on to Seng and Rabia, you can find us at theosborngroup.com, and we hope you'll join us on future chats. Take care and have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.